Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. 35 days after the start of the Israel-Hamas war, how should we respond to the multiple moral issues and dilemmas that are now literally staring us in the face? Joining me for today's discussion is Professor of International Studies at the University of Exeter and the author of The Idea of Israel and the Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, Ilan Pappe. Professor Pappe, I want to start with what many are now considering moral or philosophical questions that have arisen during the last 35 days of the Israel-Hamas war. First, there's no doubt that what Hamas did on October 7 was brutal and unforgivable terror. But why in this instance is it important to also recall the fact that it didn't happen in a vacuum? That missing history certainly doesn't justify or excuse what happened, but it does equally clearly explain it. So my question is, why is that explanation so important when we discuss what Hamas did on 7th October?
First of all, thank you, Karan, for having me on your show. It's a great pleasure and honor. Now, to your very important question, I think that the context is important because we are dealing here with a symptom of violence and not the source of violence. And if you don't deal with the source of violence, this violence will recur again and again. And you will not have the right answer to the terror or the violence if you want to prevent it in the future. This is highly important because otherwise you fall into the trap of accepting the Israeli narrative that this was done out of the blue by people who are not really human beings, are savages, subhumans, that this is all part of an anti-Semitic plot to destroy the Jewish people. Without the context, you get a narrative that does not explain correctly the violence, and apart from not preventing the next cycle of violence, seems to give license to those who were affected by the events of October the 7th to do even worse things, as we can see as unfolds in front of our eyes, to the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, and one should say also in the West Bank.
Now, when the United Nations Secretary General said that 7th October did not happen in a vacuum, he was alluding to the fact that Israel has been in occupation of the Palestinian territories since at least 1967, that many people during that period have been detained and arrested without due process, others have been killed, their lands have been illegally encroached upon. And as a result, many consider Israel's treatment of Palestine and Palestinians apartheid. Israel, on the other hand, was furious with the United Nations Secretary General when he hinted at this. So let me ask you, was Mr. Guterres right to say this, or was he wrong to do so?
The Secretary General was absolutely right in reminding us about the context. In fact, I think the context is much, historically speaking, deeper and more distant than 1967. We have to go back to 1948 to the Nakba, or what the catastrophe that befell the Palestinians in that year, because much of what Israel did in 1948, what I called in my book the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, is also an important historical context to understand what happened on that morning on the 7th of October. But in principle, he was absolutely right. Again, as I said before, because as a Secretary General of the United Nations, he is not there just to condemn or praise actions by governments. He is responsible also for processes of reconciliation, solutions of conflicts, and peace. And you cannot be engaged in such processes as a Secretary General of the United Nations if you are content only with the superficial and shallow analysis of horrific events as the one that are now unfolding in front of our eyes.
And let me ask you this, Professor Pappe. The history that we're talking about is extremely well known. It's not secret. It doesn't have to be excavated by way of archaeology. And European governments in particular know it. And the truth is, you could argue that history goes back even beyond 48 to the Balfour Declaration of 1917, or all the way to Theodor Herzl and the Zionist movement of the late 19th century. Why then have Western governments, Western newspapers, but I would exempt Western public opinion, forgotten this history?
Well, I think that this is the result of a few reasons. One of them is a quite a successful lobbying effort, first of all by the Zionist movement until 1948, and after 1948 by the State of Israel. We should not underestimate the power of lobbies to dominate narratives, to own them, and to find a way of influencing mainstream media and political discourse to adopt that narrative. So that's one reason. I mean, the Israelis were not sitting idle. They tried and still try to make their narrative the dominant one. Secondly, there is a more complex issue here, and one should differentiate in a way between certain components of the West or the global North with its kind of exceptional immunization to Israel's actions on the ground. In the case of Europe, it certainly connects to the Jewish problem of Europe, if you want. Centuries of anti-Semitism, and of course, the horrific events of the Second World War, the genocide of the Jews during the Holocaust. The support for Israel at the bottom line is a way of liberating the Europeans from dealing seriously from dealing with both their Jewish problem and with racism in general. If you support the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, in a way, from a European perspective, you've compensated both for centuries of anti-Semitism and for the Holocaust. In the case of the Americans, I think we have to add another component, which is Christian Zionism, a very powerful ideological movement that brought several presidents to the White House, and actually was there before Zionism, before Jewish Zionism. It was a movement of evangelical Christianity that until today sees the creation of a Jewish state as a precursor to the second coming of the Messiah, the end of time, and so on. So there's a theological dimension to that support. Now, if you add, and the last one I would add is, of course, the neoliberal industrial military complex that still sees Israel as an asset rather than a liability. Now, if you combine all of this, you can either say that it's either ignorance, namely not knowing the historical facts, that brings them to denial what happened, or this is a cynical denial that is the outcome of a wish not to alienate an important ally.
Let me very quickly pick up on that answer, Professor Pappe. When Western nations instinctively side with Israel, whether it's on the Palestine issue or other issues, is there a sense in which they are driven by guilt, particularly the European countries? And are they, therefore, in a sense, expiating that guilt at the cost of the Palestinians?
Yes, I do think it's, as I say, it's not exclusive. motive or reason, but it definitely plays a role. It plays more a role in countries such as France, Italy, and Germany than it would play in the role of the Scandinavian countries, for instance. So we also have to differentiate between countries in Europe. It's not a common European phenomenon, but the most important countries that determine the policies of the EU are definitely motivated by this guilt. And yes, I think they're fully aware that they are doing it at the expense of the Palestinians, as they probably would have put it. They would say that we are creating a small injustice in order to compensate for a much greater injustice. There's a good historical example for this. Probably people don't remember that, but Israel was one of the first, maybe even the first state outside of Europe to recognize a new Germany a few years after the Second World War. And the reason that the West wanted Israel to give West Germany this re-legitimization as a state of or a member of the civilized or the community of civilized nation was to say, well, you see, the state that represents the victims of the Holocaust is legitimizing a new Germany. And the quid pro quo for that was a Western reluctance to interfere in anything Israel did. And Israel was never condemned either for the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948 and other criminal policies it pursued after that.
Now, there's another aspect to what we're talking about. Israel's response to the United Nations Secretary General seemed to conflate criticism of Israel with anti Semitism. In your eyes, are the two the same, or can you legitimately criticize Israel without being accused of being anti Semitic?
Well, I think it's a very false equation, and Israel weaponizes it in order to silence criticism on it or any serious debate on Palestine. Uh, Anti-Semitism is a hatred of Jews because of their religion, and it has roots in Catholicism and Christianity in general. And this has to do with the way a certain faith is regarded by a dominant new church or a new religion. So this belongs to religious wars and racism in general. Criticizing Israel or even rejecting Zionism as a racist ideology belongs to the field of ideologies and not religion. And therefore, you are not criticizing people because of their identity. You criticize people because of what they are doing. There's a big difference between me condemning something you do because you have done it than condemning you because of your identity. And this is a very simple and a truism that somehow people who are easily intimidated by allegations of anti-Semitism seems to forget and not use when they are being condemned as being anti-Semitic when they express a very legitimate criticism of Israel.
Now, over the last month, Professor Pappe, we've repeatedly heard that Israel has a right of self defense, and there's no doubt, like any other country, it does. But then, by the same token, don't the Palestinian people have a right of self defense against occupation of their territories? In other words, doesn't this argument work both ways?
Of course, it does, and both sides, in a way, have the right to, according to international law, to defend themselves, and both sides have to abide by international law when they defend themselves. And I think what we have seen that Israel is using the right to defend itself by international law without respecting the international law while doing it, and that is the main issue here. It's not so much the right to defend yourself, but how you do defend yourself. Is genociding the people of Gaza a part of what the international law defined as a nation's right or a state's right to defend itself? I think most reasonable people with a modicum of decency in them would say no. This is something which is not connected to self-defense. It is part of revenge, and maybe it's part of something even more sinister, a wish to use as a pretext the events of the 7th of October to continue an ethnic cleansing which was not complete in 1948.
But now you've raised a deeper and actually for some very worrying moral issue there, Professor Pappe, because it's increasingly clear that Israel is exercising its right of self-defense to obliterate Hamas no matter what the cost in terms of civilian Palestine lives. In other words, as far as Israel is concerned, the end justifies the means no matter what the death toll involved. But does it? Can it ever justify the means?
No, definitely not. But you're absolutely right. I mean, if you listen to the rhetoric used by Prime Minister Netanyahu and the ministers around him, they're conjuring or bringing back sentences from the Bible, from the Old Testament, about the Amalek, the genocide of people who lived in Canaan, which was the old ancient Palestine, namely that you are entitled even religiously to kill people and everyone who is part of that people. Now this is a language that is part of a genocidal language, and according to international law, it is a stark violation of international law. So certainly, you cannot talk like this, and definitely you cannot act like this. But unfortunately, as you can see, Israel's exceptionalism so far has not stopped it from doing it. We have the first precursor, and hopefully this will be followed, of a Western leader who suddenly, I think, realized that his own support for Israel is now translated to these genocidal policies, and this is Macron, the president of France, who said that Israel does not have the right to do what it's doing right now, and for the first time calls for a ceasefire, not just a humanitarian break of fighting. I hope that other Western leaders will wake up and understand that their show of solidarity was understood in Israel as a free license to genocidal policies.
You're referring there, Professor Pape, to the interview Emmanuel Macron, the French president, gave to the BBC late last night. Let me extend that argument to Biden, Blinken, and America. Today, the Palestinian health minister, just a couple of minutes before you and I went on air, announced that 39 babies at the Al Shifa hospital had died because there was no power for their incubators. Those were clearly avoidable deaths. They're a direct result of cutting off electricity. Now, in these circumstances, when Biden and Blinken and America refuse to call for a ceasefire, can you extend the moral argument and say they too are complicit?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I'm thinking particularly about Blinken's sentence, which is if you really listen to it, every decent person in the world should be horrified when the Secretary of State of the United States says far too many Palestinians have died. Does it mean that there was a point where enough Palestinians were died and it didn't concern him? He certainly has a certain threshold, and that means that which is 11,000 innocent deaths. So up to 11,000 deaths of Palestinians, which is the equivalent of 1 million Americans, up to that equivalent, he has no problem with the massive killing. For some reason, that threshold has been crossed in his eyes, and therefore he is now worried. He's not even condemning Israel, he's just worried. No, definitely, this means you are an accomplice of what goes on because you are in a position to stop it. If you and I support or negate what's going on in Gaza, in the end of the day, we don't have the power either to encourage Israel or to stop Israel. Unfortunately, I wish we had. But he and President Biden, they have the power to end the misery in Gaza, and not doing it is definitely being complicit in what goes on there on the ground.
I'll just point out something to the audience that is inherent in what you pointed out. The comment that Blinken made was made, in fact, in New Delhi late last night, where he said that far too many Palestinians have been killed. That clearly means not just that there's a threshold, but that they're quite happy for that threshold to be reached. It's exceeding it that's a problem. America, in other words, has accepted a fairly substantial number of innocent Palestinians. Women and children will be killed, and that's okay. That is part of the moral qualm or dilemma inherent in that statement.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that this was not a slip of the tongue. This is an exposition, an exposure, sorry, of the genuine position of these American policymakers. Let's remember, of the Democratic Party that supposedly brings to the table more concern to human rights and civil rights than their Republican counterparts. And history would judge them as not as they would like to be judged, as the brave American leaders who stood by Israel at its time of trouble, but as people who stood by and allowed a crime against humanity to be perpetrated on the ground.
Now, Professor Pappe, you spoke a moment ago about a second Nakba of making the Palestinian people who are already refugees in Gaza refugees a second time round. There are reports that Israeli think tanks, and reportedly those reports have been considered by Israeli ministries, but not officially by the Israeli cabinet. These reports speak of pushing the people of Gaza into the Sinai. They talk about calculating the cost of doing so, as well as alleged benefits that might accrue to the government of Egypt, which would then have to receive them. If that really is what Israel is contemplating, i.e., pushing Palestinians completely out of their territories, wouldn't that be a second Nakba as well? Would it not amount to the phrase you used, ethnic cleansing?
Well, first of all, let me say that the current political leadership in Israel is not doesn't have a unanimous idea of what to do after the war. I mean, they're quite united in supporting the military operations on the ground, but when you listen to interviews they are giving and they are asked, what would you do the day after, you get more than one answer. So what you are referring to is the clear position of the Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu. And although in normal times his position would be what matters, we don't exactly know how precarious his political career would be after the war. But yes, you're right. This is his position. He is putting pressure on Egypt to create that kind of huge refugee city in the Sinai, within Egyptian territory. First of all, the Egyptians would never agree to that. So it won't happen. It really won't happen. But they would try and do it. If it were to happen, you're absolutely right. This is just another Nakba, another ethnic cleansing. But one should say already the ethnic cleansing of 1.6 million Palestinians from the north of the Gaza Strip to the south of the Gaza Strip is an ethnic cleansing. Also because most of the houses of these Palestinians in the north were demolished. So they have become refugees, already have become refugees once more. There is another Israeli plan from the right wing, the extreme right wing, who wants to settle, Judaize the north of the Gaza Strip and create a big prison, open prison in the south. And then you have the more moderate members of the new emergency government that Israel established after the 7th of October, like the leader of the main opposition, Benjamin Gantz, who wants to introduce the Palestinian Authority back into the picture and let them rule the Gaza Strip as an area similar to the rules that they are imposing in the West Bank under Israeli auspices since the implementation of the Oslo Agreement in 1993.
Now, there is something else that I'd like to put to you, Professor Pappe. It's a point made by President Sisi of Egypt, and I'd like to ask you as a historian if he's correct. According to the Washington Post, when Secretary of State Blinken visited Cairo last month, President Sisi said to him, I object to the fact that just a couple of days earlier, in the company of Netanyahu, you stressed your Jewish ancestry. He said, clearly, we Arabs have lived for centuries with Jews peacefully. The problem is a European problem. Don't impose it on us. And what I want to ask you, is Sisi right when he says that for centuries Arabs and Jews lived happily together peacefully in what was then called Palestine. Is this true of the 18th and 19th centuries? Indeed, is it true up to the creation of Israel in 48?
Yes, I think it's a very valid historical fact that the Egyptian president has expressed. Until 1948, even, but definitely until the end of the Ottoman Turkish rule, that is, until the end of the First World War, communities of Jews, Christians, Muslim, Druze, and other denominations coexisted to the point that they used to live in the same villages, share the same streets in towns, and celebrated each other's festivities and mourned in each other's disasters. I'm not idealizing it, as always in these mosaic of communal existence. There are moments of tensions, and not every moment is a moment of harmony and coexistence. But we are talking about the big picture, and the big picture is of a genuine coexistence. Uh, um, I think that even at moments of tension, as Gayatri Spivak calls it, there was conflictual coexistence, namely the ability very, very quickly to come back to coexistence, even at time of crisis. And this is absolutely true. And one good indication how it changed is the fact that while we never had villages who were just Muslims or Christians in Palestine pre 1948, now the villages, some of them are just belonging to one particular religious identity. And this is the result of the divide and rule policies of Israel since 1948 and the new reality that unfolded after the Nakba.
So it's very much an attribute of Israeli policy and treatment of Arabs and Palestinians that has created this fissure and rift between the two.
Absolutely, yes. It's like the old imperial conduct, divide and rule. The last thing you want as an oppressor or occupier or ruler is the people you are ruling against their will to be united, because then they become more galvanized and more powerful in their resistance. So you do all you can to divide and sow seeds of conflict in them. And this is not unique to Israel, but definitely is a different mode of behavior compared to those who were the rulers of Palestine until 1948.
Before I end, Professor Pape, let me briefly put to you three moral issues that I think arise out of the military strategy that Israel has deployed in Gaza. To begin with, as you know, Israel cut off electricity, water, fuel, food, and medicine. There's no doubt that was collective punishment and a morally questionable thing to do. But is it understandable, or at least excusable, on the grounds that it was perhaps the only way of trying to separate the Palestinian people from Hamas by encouraging the Palestinians to leave Gaza and go south, and thus avoid becoming collateral damage when the attack on Hamas started? Can it be excused on those grounds, or even those slender grounds are inappropriate?
To my mind, that they are inappropriate. What Israel is doing actually, it tells Palestinians, unless you are leaving the hospital, unless you're leaving your houses, unless you're willing to be at our mercy in the south, you're not civilians. Doesn't matter whether you're a baby, an old lady, or a crippled person. You are not civilians. You are part of the Hamas military setup. This is unacceptable, and not new, by the way, in the history of Israel and the Palestinians. In 1948, Israel regarded the Palestinian villages as enemy bases and treated it as such. No, I don't think that this is a justified way of operating or explaining to yourself or others why you are attacking hospitals, schools, and why you are claiming that while you do it, you are respecting international law. This is a violation of international law. And, this is not different from any moral decision people have to take. when they have someone they want to catch or someone they want to arrest in a building, you don't destroy the whole building. If someone hides in a neighborhood in New Delhi because the police thinks that they should be questioned, they don't destroy the whole neighborhood in order to get to that person. I mean, the logic of this is so distorted that I suppose it takes time to understand that you are really presented with something that cannot be sustained either morally, and I would say is not even logically, to be honest.
Let me raise a second moral issue that emerges out of Israel's military strategy in Gaza. Now, as you know, Israel told the Palestinians to move south for their safety. That was said repeatedly and loudly. But when they did, they were bombed first on the Salahuddin Road and the coastal Rashid Road. Secondly, those that did make it south were bombed in Khan Yunis, in Rafah, and even in refugee camps like Maghazi and Nusayrat. Does this raise moral issues to do with deliberate deception and falsehood? Or is this just what happens in war?
Well, I think what it really means is that the life of civilians in Gaza is a very low priority for the Israelis. I think that's what it means. I don't think they intentionally bomb refugees who are living from the north to the south, but they are not going not to bomb them if they think that the bombing in that area serves the strategic objectives. And I think that's how we should look at it, which really means the bottom line of this: you cannot use this strategy if you want to say that the civilian life in Gaza is important for you. If the civilian life in Gaza is important to you, you first of all agree to a ceasefire. You have your own civilians that the Israelis don't seem to care about. The people who were taken to Gaza, the 240, many of them civilians. If you really care about civilians on both sides, you first of all agree to a ceasefire, and then you start negotiation of exchange of prisoners and of how to move next without bombing Gaza with an amount of TNT that, as we know, by now exceeded the kind of bombs that were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima during the Second World War. So it's the whole notion that within that operation you can secure the life of Palestinian civilians, and when you are presented with the numbers of how many children were killed, you say that the Hamas is responsible for that, is really not a very serious argument, and it just shows the priority that the military that now operates there has, and where do the citizens of Gaza are located in that priority list.
You mentioned hostages, and that reminds me of the fact that in 2010, or maybe it was 2011, when Netanyahu himself was still prime minister, Israel exchanged, I think it was 1,027 Palestinian prisoners for one solitary Israeli soldier. This time, there are arguably up to 242 hostages, of which 5 have been either released or escaped. But there are still somewhere around 236 hostages. But Israel repeatedly refuses an exchange. Hamas has, on 2 or 3 different occasions, suggested one, but Israel keeps refusing. Does that suggest that this time around, Israel is valuing its hostages very differently to the way it did 11, 12, 13 years ago?
Yes, I think something has changed in the way, if you want, in the contract between Israel and its own Jewish citizens. And it's quite incredible how it took the families, or most of the families, of those whose dear ones were taken together to realize it. I mean, I think one of the reasons they were silent in the first 3 or 4 weeks of the operations were that, like you, they assumed that if Israel was willing to pay, if you want, such a price for one soldier, definitely in the case of their family members who are even not soldiers, surely Israel would do at least the same, if not more, in order to get them back home. It took them time to understand that this particular government, this particular political leadership, is not learning the right lessons from what happens on the 7th of October. And one of the lessons it thinks it rightly learned was that it should not consider the life of those who were taken as important as their political strategies. I don't know how many in the Israeli Jewish society are now realizing that. I know the families do. We can see a very clear change in the slogans of the demonstrations conducted by the families, which are not the only demonstrations Israel allows to take place. The tone has changed. The message of the families has changed. It would be interesting to see how many among the Israeli Jewish society would join them in demanding a different strategy with regard to the abducted ones, which will necessitate a different strategy altogether towards the war in Gaza.
Now, Professor Pappe, an office called the Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, COGAT for short, has told the BBC just 2 days ago that there is no humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Colonel Goran claims there is food, and I'm quoting him, for weeks to come. And he says more than enough water. Practically every other agency has said the opposite. This includes the WHO, UNRWA, Save the Children, and the United Nations Secretary General himself. So, in these circumstances, does the COGAT statement raise moral questions about Israel's acceptance or denial of reality, and also about its attitude to the privations and traumas of human beings, whether they're Palestinian or not?
I don't think for one moment he believes in what he said. I think he knows that he's lying. I don't think that it's ignorance or lack of knowledge. It's part of a propaganda war. But this is not the first time that you hear statesmen that are so easily refuted by facts on the ground. I think it's done for the first of all, for domestic consumption. And it's directed towards those in the West who are blindly supporting Israel. I don't think that it's possible in this time and age to air such an absurd statement on the reality on the ground. We have seen the interviews with some American citizens who were working as aid workers in hospitals. And I don't remember the name of the person, but she was interviewed in the CNN. And she said very interestingly, she said that had not some of the doctors in the hospital cared also for the American citizens who volunteered to help the Palestinians, they would have starved to death. Because some of the Palestinians said, why should we share the little food we have and the little water we have with Americans? And you can understand that there was a lot of tension under these circumstances. So she gave a very clear idea that if someone doesn't take care of you, you don't have access to water, to food, and basic health services. And I'm afraid that quite a few people in Gaza are not able to have that kind of luxury as those Americans had in terms of getting enough food and water to survive.
You're absolutely right, Professor Pappe. She said that if the Palestinian staff that work with them had not shared their water and their food, the Americans would have died by now. You're absolutely right.
Exactly.
My last question, Professor Pappe, in contrast to Western governments who are sympathetic and supportive of Israel, public opinion in those countries, and increasingly so, has come out in massive support of the Palestinian people. And this is, I believe, particularly true of young Europeans and young Americans. Do you see this as a political position that they're adopting or as a moral statement that they're making?
I think it's a moral statement that says that they don't believe politics can be conducted without moral consideration, because they adopt the similar position not only on the issue of Palestine. You can see that when they discuss global warming, when they discuss poverty, when they discuss the cynical exploitation of workers and the treatment of minorities in the global north, that they are asking their governments to inject morality into the policies and don't act as if this is an unnecessary dimension of policy making. So I think it's a very clear moral position. And I think it's particularly enhanced by the fact that for so many of them, Palestine epitomizes other injustices in the world. They don't think it's the worst kind of injustice, but it's the most important one because it really is covered with hypocrisy and double talk. And we can see it when we compare it to the war in the Ukraine. And therefore, I think that this will continue. And you're absolutely right. It's a generational thing. And I think this at least bodes well for the future that civil societies would stand by the Palestinians, even if their governments refuse to do so.
Do you think awareness of this lies behind President Macron's comments to the BBC when he called for a ceasefire, where he said it was unacceptable to kill women and children and old people? And do you also think it could, in time, influence Biden, who has an election staring him in the face in less than 12 months?
Yes, unfortunately, we can only think of politicians changing or even entering a position that might not be popular with their own peers in their own government's administration when electoral considerations are being the main reason. I always hope that there's also a modicum of humanity there as well. But I think as politician, he's fully aware that this may tar his profile within his own community. But let's hope that this is also because he also is moved as a human being, not just as a politician, and who cannot be moved as a human being by what is so visible on our screens and what comes out from the reports. I hope Biden would be the same, and if it's only political consideration or electoral consideration, be it, as long as we don't have to wait for too long for the ceasefire to be imposed on Israel by these powerful members of the international community.
Professor Ilan Pappe, thank you very much for the time you've given me. I'm deeply grateful to you.
Thank you very much, Karan, for having you on your show. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.